So this architecture diagram comes from a standard called Oasis XACML or XACML, or as you once called it, Jerry, Whack-A-Mole.
It's
But in
possible.
fact, yeah, you remember that? Um, in fact, that architecture wasn't really invented by XACML. If you go back to, I think, the 1970s, you'll find some network standards that also mention the whole concept of a PEP, a policy enforcement point, and a PDP, a policy decision point. And then more recently, NIST formalized it in the ABAC 800-162 architecture. They reformalized it in the zero trust. That's a typo there. It should say NIST zero trust, not NIST ABAC on the second point. 800-207 architecture. So it's a very common architecture that essentially decouples the app from the enforcement, from the decision making. And Jerry, I think you added an overlay here to identify the particular flow happening in step 2 and step 5. Why is that?
Well, that like I said before, when a bunch of people got together that were looking at places that could be standardized, this is what we focused on. That is the interaction between the enforcement point and the decision point. Because what was certainly discussed there is that the format of those messages is very similar across many different implementations. So that seemed like the very first logical place to start to standardize. Now, you've got some information later on where we'll talk about some of the future work that can be done. But this is where, when we look at version 1.0 of AuthZEN, this is what the focus area is.
Yeah, and it allows us to swap in, swap out policy decision points without impacting the enforcement point. So if we take, for instance, two of the major authorization implementations, Open Policy Agent on the one hand and XACML on the other, up until the days of AuthZEN, you couldn't easily swap them out because they had different interfaces, albeit 90% the same. Now we've actually achieved the 100%, so you can actually just plug in whatever PDP you want to use.
Of course, David, that assumes you have all the metadata and the policies are similar or the same in the PDPs, but otherwise the message exchange here will be identical.
Correct. Yeah. So it assumes that the scenarios in the backend are the same.